So part two of religious wars, we're going to move over to the English Civil War, kind of done dealing with, for the moment, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the 30 Years' War. Moving over to what's going on in England, the English Civil War, the Puritan Revolution, and the rise of Parliament. So to recap some of the backstory, Elizabeth I had died in 1603 and named James I, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, as her heir. Elizabeth, as we have talked, had ruled her country with the help of advisors, but did not always listen to Parliament. And over time, the Parliament began to resent her arbitrary rule. But they will rally around her when the Armada, the Spanish Armada, attacks. As we stated, Elizabeth was a politique. She was flexible and played fast and loose with religious doctrine, kind of balancing in the middle, with some toleration for most peoples within the Anglican Church, playing a line there, putting the state kind of above religion. She was a unique monarch because she was loved and feared. After her death, the ruling House of England is no longer going to be Tudor, but moved to the Stuart family. Spain, still England's rival, was diminished as a European power, as we talked about with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It was highly dependent on the New World for its wealth, as we talked about in the Age of Exploration. And industry and trade had begun to decline. Yet in the area of literature and painting, it was going through a golden age, as we spoke about. So it's also called the Golden Age of Spain, although in world matters, declining a little bit. So, but for the British at this time, Spain's rival, the 16th century will be a time of achievement. That we have Shakespeare and Milton, music and science at its height, kind of those remnants of the Renaissance after it moved out of Italy into England. Trade is up with coal and wool. The textile industries we talked about, very significant in England, and all will begin to contribute to England's wealth. So for this lecture, we're going to turn to England and Scotland after Elizabeth's death. And now England and Scotland will be united under one king, King James. On the continent, European continent, kings continue to clash with nobles, or the weakening of the noble class and the rise of our new monarchs, and the destructive 30 Years' War we discussed in part one. In England, a workable form of government is going to be created. This is often described in history books as the rise of the Parliament, the rise of the English Parliament. So, divine right monarchy, James I and Charles I is going to be the subject of our first piece of lecture here. James I will take the throne in 1603, and he strongly believes in the idea of divine right, idea of monarchy. Divine right meaning that kings were answerable to God, that God had placed them on the throne. Since the reign of the Stuart King James I, reign 1603 to 1625, there will be a struggle between the king and parliament regarding taxation and civil liberties. As I said, both King James I and his successor, Charles I, which we'll talk about, believed in divine right, or kings, and absolutism, or absolute power, because God had placed them on the throne. The monarchy at this time is also going to strongly defend the Anglican Church that Elizabeth had put in place. Though he was raised a Protestant by the Scots, when his mother Mary of Scots was exiled in England, James saw religion as a state institution, and he begins to resent the extreme Puritanism equals Calvinism equals that were independent of the state notion that was expanding in England. At the same time, many Englishmen will migrate to the New World in the 1600s seeking great religious autonomy. This is where we have the group of Puritans and the groups we've talked about as a result of Calvinism that end up in the New World and the expansive movement of these peoples. The most famous of these to us will be the Pilgrims in 1621. And at this time, the 13 colonies will begin to form in the Americas, in North America. James is going to assert his royal rights over these colonies. He also needed money and was cash-strapped due to archaic systems of money collection, so that the taxation system being very old world in England, and so it's going to limit his ability to collect money to assert his control over these new colonies. It is noted in history that James was a homosexual and had many young favorites, including one called Steenie, the Duke of Buckingham, who he will lavish money on and land grants on. This will become really a subject of London gossip, just a little bit of social history background, but it's going to further kind of weaken his reputation and what his lavish spending here, as we'll see with other monarchs as we as we move into absolutism. One of the great achievements of James' reign was the King James Bible, which we'll discuss at a later time, but remember we've had the English translation already put out, which will be the basis of the King James Version later. After many years of illness, James will die in 1625. And his son, Charles I, will succeed him. And like his father, he too is going to need some cash to keep control over the colonies, to keep control over England, to fund the Anglican Church. So portraiture here. Charles. Parliament disliked the way that both Charles and James were insisting that a king should be able to raise taxes on his own authority without the Parliament's consent. So Charles is going to rule just like his father as an absolute monarch between 1629 and 1640. He is going to raise money, as I said, using medieval forms of forced taxation. Those with a certain amount of wealth will be obligated to pay, and the Parliament is not going to like the way that King Charles is choosing to collect taxes. Many members of Parliament also resent the Star Chamber, or that court that we talked about that was set up by Henry VII, which continued to settle cases within England. And the English Parliament had unique traits at this time. There was only one Parliament. The Parliament has two houses, the House of Lords, which is going to consist mainly of hereditary noblemen, and the House of Commons will consist of our lesser nobles, merchants, and mayors. Both houses are dominated by landowners. And so we're talking about this land here being enclosed. We talked about the earlier enclosure acts that will come back into play here, but rich landowners. Charles I, third Parliament in 4 years, met on March 17th of 1628, and will immediately start discussing recent grievances against the way the king had been treating them. The Commons leader, Sir Edward Coke, a lawyer, will come up with the Petition of Right, a statement of a person's fundamental rights which the king should agree to honor. Angry about this and other concessions, Charles will dissolve the Parliament in 1629. He dissolves the Parliament twice during his reign of 1625 to 1649, and this dissolvement of Parliament will be for 11 years. Parliament will not, again, be given permission by the king to meet for 11 years. So, as I said, the Parliament can only meet with a royal summons. Even today, this tradition is honored by Queen Elizabeth II, who invites Parliament to sit each fall. Over the next few years, Charles will antagonize the government. He supports the Church of England over the Puritans, and he attempts to raise funds without the consent of Parliament. The straw, as you could say, that breaks the camel's back is that the king needed to modernize the navy with ship money. Remember, we have the emerging English naval power after the Spanish Armada, and he is going to need to modernize this navy with what is called ship money. All counties are now required to pay outfit ships, where before only coastal communities had to pay for these needs. Those who lived in the middle counties didn't want to share the expense. They haven't had to. They're resistant to this change. They asserted the right that taxes could not be levied without the permission of Parliament, which King James has disbanded. The ability to suppress revolts was weakened by this deadlock between the king and the Parliament. Charles cannot raise the money that he needs. The Scots will rebel in 1637 when England tried to force the Anglican Church over the Presbyterian Church as the state religion. Charles will invite Parliament to meet for the first time in 11 years. Remember, it had been dissolved in 1629. And Parliament, who has not been happy this entire time, proved hostile to his demands. He will dissolve it again. This is the second time, the second dissolvement of Parliament during his reign, until new members could be elected. But the same men will be voted in. So he's dealing with the same Parliament. This Parliament would be the same for 20 years, 1640 to 1660, and in that time, England is going to suffer a civil war. But we call this term, this 20 years of Parliament, the Long Parliament. The Long Parliament moves on the king's prerogatives. It abolished the Star Chamber of Henry. It allowed for royal advisors to be punished and not have royal immunity. And it abolished the office of bishop in the Anglican Church. In 1642, the English Civil War will begin. It's religious persecution of the Puritans by Charles I that will become the biggest reason for the English Civil War, because the Puritans gained Scottish support by promising to support Presbyterianism as a state religion. Remember, Presbyterianism has become the majority faith in Scotland when we talked about the Protestant Reformation. Most of the support is from the wealthy southeast of England. And the king will draw his followers from various nobles in the north and west of England. This map will show the gradual triumph of the parliaments whose control of London and the coastal areas gave them a profound logistical advantage during the wars. And so this is going to show the progression of our English Civil War. You can see the royalists here. We'll talk about the royalists, the supporters here of the king and the parliament's control in green. And you can see this change as we move through the English Civil War. The parliamentary forces are going to be called the Roundheads, and the royal forces will be called the Cavaliers, or those who support the king, royalists. The leader of the Puritans was named Oliver Cromwell. He's a fiercely Puritan independent and military leader of the Roundheads, eventually led his new model army to victory in 1649, which we will discuss. A division between Puritans and Presbyterians and non-Puritans will develop later in the war. The Pride's Purge in 1648 is the elements of the new model army, without Cromwell's knowledge, removed all non-Puritans and Presbyterians from Parliament, leaving a rump, what's called a rump parliament, with only 1/5 of its members remaining. And we'll discuss this as this moves on. So Oliver Cromwell, important to us as the leader here. His military force, as I said, was called the New Model Army, also nicknamed the Ironsides. Cromwell will be able to defeat the Royalists or the Cavaliers, as we've called them, and Charles will be captured. Okay, so the painting there of Charles being captured. Cromwell feels very strongly that Charles should be put to death, and when Parliament hesitated, he will break the Parliament up and select those who are willing to eliminate what he calls the tyrant, or Charles I. As I said, this is called Pride's Purge, after the man whom Cromwell appointed to clear out Parliament. The new Parliament was now much reduced, down to 50 members, but it would now at last be able to agree to the trial of Charles I. As I said, this is called the Rump Parliament, only 1/5 of the members left, and the removement of non-Puritans and Presbyterians from Parliament so that they can come to an agreement on the trial of Charles I. And it would have the dubious honor of trying and executing a king. There had never been a formal trial of a king. Old manuscripts had to be looked at to figure out if it had happened in ancient Roman times. Of course, there had always been assassinations, but never a trial. The trial was held, and Charles was found guilty of treason, and he was executed in 1649. He was beheaded. He is the first king in European history to be executed by his own subjects. And his wife and children at this time had fled to France. And so this portrait here of the beheading, or the public beheading of Charles I, the first king in European history to be executed by his own subjects. This is the blood-stained shirt of Charles I from his beheading. Okay, so what happens at this time after the beheading of Charles I is called the Interregnum. 1649 to 1660, or a rule without a king. The Commonwealth from 1649 to 1653 is a republic that was created after the war that abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords. The new republic, however, is going to fail to govern effectively, and Cromwell will dissolve the Rump Parliament in 1653. Next becomes a time period known as the Proctorate. This is Oliver Cromwell will refuse the crown of England, saying he would instead take the title of Lord Protector, which is really a dictatorship. He is going to deny religious freedom to Anglicans and Catholics at this time, and allow Jews to return to England in 1655. Jews had not been allowed since 1290. In 1649, Cromwell is going to invade Ireland to put down an Irish uprising that had favored royalist forces in England. This is called the Act of Settlement in 1652. The land from 2/3 of Catholic property owners was given to Protestant English colonists. Cromwell's control of Ireland through the New Model Army was particularly brutal. Perhaps 15 to 20% of the Irish population perished under Cromwell's policies. Cromwell will conquer Scotland in 1651 to 1652. The Scots had continued strong support of the Presbyterians in England that had been removed by Cromwell. England's rule over Scotland was far more peaceful than in Ireland. In Ireland, as I said, thousands of Catholics died under Cromwell's rule, and the land will be distributed to the Protestants, two-thirds of the land, so about 15 to 20% of the Irish population perishing under Cromwell's rule. In all senses, Cromwell was an able and just man, but he will forever be stained by the deeds of his army in Ireland. And because of this, Cromwell will rule England with as much difficulty as Charles I, the king whom he had executed. His Puritan dictatorship will seek to regulate the moral life of England by commanding that people follow strict moral codes that will be enforced by the army. Dancing, gambling, drinking, alcohol, and prostitution were against the law. This will seriously alienate many English people from Cromwell's rule. He will also limit Dutch trade, turning a former ally into an enemy under the Navigation Acts. He will gain, however, Jamaica for the British. But for many, the idea of a Lord Protector instead of a king seemed pretty extreme. There was lingering guilt about Charles I's execution. And so during this time, Quakers led by George Fox will emerge as a religion. Quakers are descendants of the Anabaptists, and John of Leyden, and the Anabaptist movement, baptism as a conversion experience later. They believed in an inner light, a divine spark that existed in each person. They rejected church authority. As pacifists, they were opposed to war, and they allowed women to play a role in preaching. The Levelers, another group that will emerge at this time, are radical religious revolutionaries. They sought social and political reforms in a more egalitarian society and believed in universal suffrage. The Diggers wanted to occupy and farm common lands. They were against private ownership of land. Remember, our landowners being very wealthy and involved in our former Parliament. They denied Parliament's authority and rejected private ownership of land. Cromwell opposed all of these groups, but he could not turn to the Anglicans and Royalists for support. Remember, he had killed their king, so he is no longer in their favor and cannot turn to them to kind of dismantle or oppose these groups. And over time, Cromwell will depend on a military rule to govern England, but he will die in 1658 and will be succeeded by his son, Richard, who will be as ineffective as his successor, father, Cromwell. Richard was unable to control the country. England looked to the dead king's son, Charles II, to return from France, where they had fled after his father's beheading, and restore the monarchy. In 1660, Charles II will return to England to take the throne, and the restoration will begin at this time. So the Stuart line under Charles II, who will reign from 1660 to 1685, will be restored in 1660.